he reminded me of Johnny Depp. I think it's pretty clear that Don here understands something about fantasy. As both a speaker and a teacher, he uses stories as a frequent and favorite tool for making points both understandable and memorable. Today, he's going to dig into what makes stories so powerful, why they move us so much. In the process, you will learn just exactly what is the greatest story never told. A big hand for Don King.
Thank you, Trent. I'm not sure exactly why the Johnny Depp thing was so funny. I don't quite understand. Well, anyway, I want to start out with a question for you guys. How did stories start when you were 6 years old? Once upon a time, yeah, just about everybody had that experience. Now, these days, they may start out with, y'all ain't gonna believe this. But in any case, even as adults, stories start out with, one time this happened. One time. We use stories as human beings. It's very human to tell stories. We try to make sense of our experience. And one of the ways of doing that is through telling stories. When I was a kid, my parents used telling a story as the equivalent of telling a lie. Did any of you hear that phraseology as a child? Stories may be part of what it is to be human, but it's also part of what it is to be a kid. If a lamp got broken, for example, what happened to the lamp, Don? Well, see, the dog and Don, are you telling a story? And then feeling a little bit ashamed, of course. But it is true that any story, even the most factual story, has an element about it that's not exactly a lie, but is not necessarily a matter of fact, and that's the explanation, the meaning that the story has for us. That's where the making sense of experience comes in. I would like to tell you a bit of a story. If you could go back with me to that day in 2002, you would see me walking with an older man, my dad, 85 years old at the time. They are visiting the sister home where they live in Jackson. They're here in Knoxville. We're walking on manicured lawns, surrounded by well-trimmed trees. Mom and my wife are walking about 20 yards in front of us because Dad is uncharacteristically walking slowly today. Usually he's a fast stepper, but a very quiet person. You have to understand that Dad was always very active. He ran marathons up into his 70s. This picture is from a race, 6.2-mile race, in which he was the winner in his age group, which was over 55. He was 67 at this time and was the oldest person to finish the race. And if you saw him on the day I'm talking about, you could still see a hint of those muscles, of that strength. As we walk further and talk quietly, he checks the distance again, and then he says, "This was in the newspaper today." And he reaches in his wallet and pulls out a newspaper clipping and hands it to me. As I read it, I realize that I am reading the climax of a story 60 years in the telling. You have to understand that my dad was the epitome of the strong, silent type. If you can't see the label down at the bottom, this is him down front. He grew up in the Depression, parachuted out of airplanes, stormed the beaches of Europe. He spent 16 months in a German POW camp that probably saved his life. But he also left a part of his spirit on the battlefield. But his war story is not the greatest story never told. Joseph Campbell talked about the nature of story, among a lot of other people. The hero's journey. Did we just lose the microphone, by the way? Okay, thank you. Must be my ears going out then. A lot of other people talked about the nature of story, what it takes to have a story. But among the discussion, what we usually come up with is that there is a hero who faces a challenge. And in the process of facing that challenge is changed by it. Whether he overcomes it or the challenge overcomes him, it's still a good story. There will be conflict and there will be change. To me, that's what it takes to make a story a story. Now, for most of his life, Dad didn't really talk about his war experiences. He didn't want to talk really about his younger years much at all. But as he aged, the armor that he built around his soul started to crack a little bit, and bits and pieces of his story would leak out. I would say over a 20-year period, I was able to ultimately put together the whole arc of his story. There was a break in the dam eventually. Along about 1999, Janet and I were on a trip to Florida to see her family. You young people can make that trip in one day, but we took 2 days to get down there. We had been there for 2 hours when we got a phone call from Mom. She said, "Dad is having a breakdown, and you need to get back here now." We drove 16 hours without stopping, picked him up, and went to the VA hospital in Johnson City, where he talked to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist said he had the worst case of post-traumatic stress disorder that she had ever seen. We ate Christmas dinner in a Chinese restaurant, just like that movie. They didn't sing to us, but still we ate Christmas dinner in a Chinese restaurant and we went on to the VA so that he could begin to get some counseling for this. And this is when things really started to come out, when I really began to learn something of his story. Dr. John Bradshaw, in his book Family Secrets, tells us that families where there is a secret, they have a tendency for the children to know the secret on some level anyway. And they tend to reenact whatever the secret is. Families where they talk openly about the issues, they process it and work through it and move on. Mom and Dad didn't have secrets that they were ashamed of. At least if they did, I didn't find out about them. And they didn't tell me. But they did have things they thought they needed to protect me from. I need for you now in your mind to go back with me even further. 1938, 1939, sometime around that period. We're in West Tennessee, and if you have forgotten your history, you need to know that the war in Europe is just starting, but we're not in it yet. It's obvious, though, that the world is going to go to war. And so there's some stuff going on in West Tennessee that is tied to that. If you were there, I started to say with me, this was 15 years before I was more than a gleam in Dad's eye. But if we had been there that day riding the bus, unair conditioned, the heat and humidity of West Tennessee blowing in the window, miles and miles of white cotton fields, and at the front of the bus a 22-year-old man with hair as white as the cotton, hair that gave him his lifelong nickname, Whitey, although later in life his hair turned brown and stayed that way. He's a bit surly because he's not really doing what he wants to do. He dropped out of high school 6 years prior to this. My grandfather started this bus line partly as an entrepreneur, but also partly to get Dad out of the pool hall and get him to earn his living. And he is ferrying people to the Milan Army ammunition plant, where they work to provide the munitions that will feed the war. He would rather be playing baseball, something that he's really good at. He's the pitcher for this team, and those of you who follow the history of baseball may recognize the Mud Hens. The Toledo Mud Hens were the parent club. This was a semi-pro club that was associated with them. But back in those days, you couldn't really make a living at baseball, at least at that level. And so he drives the bus. One day, the day that we are considering now, a 17-year-old girl gets on the bus. And she's the most beautiful thing he has ever seen in his life. By the way, to protect privacy, I'm changing the names of everybody in this story except for my family. He gets up the courage to strike up a conversation with her, finds out her name is Mary. She has gotten a job at the plant, and she's going to be riding that bus every day. Suddenly, the hated job becomes the focal point of his life. And to make a longer story shorter and to preserve their privacy, let's just say that a hot romance developed. But, given the era, given the part of the country, given social norms at the time, men don't talk about their feelings. He never tells her exactly how he feels. And eventually she breaks up with him, starts dating a guy from his hometown who's also working at the plant. They ride the bus together every day. And he has to watch this budding romance in his rearview mirror. Until one day he can't stand it anymore and he quits and joins the army. By this time he is nearly 24 years old. He's old enough that he would not have been drafted. Part of this, though, is that he is a patriot. Part of it is he still needs to earn a living. And part of it is it's the best way for him to get the hell out of that town so he doesn't have to see this every day. He finds out that the paratroopers pay an extra $25 a month, and so he signs up as a volunteer. The first airplane he ever rides in, he has to jump out of. In fact, every airplane he ever rides in his whole life, he jumps out of. And then there's Pearl Harbor. We're at war. Some of you guys saw the movie Saving Private Ryan. Did you see that movie? Okay, a lot of folks in here. That was about D-Day. Dad's unit was one of the major units in that invasion. They took the brunt of the early invasion. If I remember correctly, they had over 50% casualties. But Dad missed D-Day because of an earlier invasion that is now known as the Battle of Anzio. Very similar to the D-Day invasion, but in Italy. Was supposed to last about a month. Through the bungling of commanders, it lasted about 5 months. There were 7,000 Allied soldiers who died in the Battle of Anzio, 36,000 wounded or missing in action. And one of those people who was missing in action was Dad. Grandmother King got a telegram, and as you can see, this is a news story, but it was the day after she got the telegram. Notice the dates here. Missing since January 6th. Telegram arrived on April 19th. For that period of time, they had no idea what happened to him. And really, this wasn't much better because missing in action means we've just noticed he's not here. We don't know what happened. About, a month later, they got the official telegram that he was a POW in a German prison camp. 16 months of prison at that time. Privation that we can't imagine. There's not enough time for us to go into the details of the imprisonment. Let's just say it takes its toll physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. At the end of his imprisonment, some of you history folks may have heard of this one. Everybody pretty much has heard of the Bataan Death March. That was in the Pacific Theater. There was a similar march called the Black March in Europe. And Dad was part of that, an 86-day trek that we'll talk a little bit more about in just a moment. There were, let me see here. By the way, this is not the greatest story never told. But we do need to read a chapter right here to set something up. Not to take anything away from the experience of Vietnam veterans or the POWs from that era. The statistics, though, tell us that there were about 750 POWs in all of the Vietnam War. World War II, there were 16 million men and women in uniform. About 500,000 of them died. There were, depending on the figures that you read, around 257,000 POWs. Those figures are just amazing to me. Now, in Europe, those POWs were housed in about 200 camps. The one Dad was in, which we're seeing right here, Stalag Luft 4, actually he was in 6 of them, but this is the one where he spent the most time. It was built to hold 6,000 prisoners. It housed 10,000 at the time that he was in there. Now, I want you to keep those figures in mind when I tell you that one day he looked up and he's got a new bunkmate. Do you want to guess who the new bunkmate was? Cleo, that guy that Mary had since married, by the way. What are the odds? I could ask Dave Vinson to figure the odds. I can't figure those odds. Now, when I told this story to a colleague, she said, that was a God moment. And maybe it was. I'm not doubting that it was. I do know that human beings have a tendency to seek explanations in everything. We look for patterns. We immediately go to that. And the problem with that can be that we may see patterns where there are no patterns. That's why we see faces and animals and people doing strange things in clouds. Doesn't mean it wasn't a God moment, but it does mean that we seek to get that explanation. And where it can be a problem is later on it's hard to separate fact from what we thought about fact. Our thoughts from our observations. Later it can feel like the same thing and we might report them as being fact. Let's give a little context right here. An old dead Greek guy named Epictetus, ancient philosopher, said something like this: it's not what happens to you, but what you think about what happens to you that determines your experience. Let's kind of illustrate it with this. When I was a teenager, I don't remember the proper source to give credit here, but it was a science fiction novel or a short story. A story within that story went like this. If I told you about a woman who was walking down the street, a man grabbed her, threw her to the ground, began beating her, while the crowd just stood around and watched, did nothing to stop him. What would you think about him? What would you think about the crowd? We've seen news stories like that, haven't we? By the way, I forgot to mention that her clothes were on fire. He was trying to put out the flames. Does that change what you think about him in the situation? So see, here's one of the things to keep in mind. There are very few things. I don't think there's anything that we can know everything about it. We can't know everything about anything. But we immediately start trying to put together an explanation and think we've come up with the answer. The point is not to stop making assumptions. We can't live without making assumptions. You folks right here in this room, you've made an assumption that this building is built well enough that the ceiling is not going to collapse on us. I think it's a good assumption. I'm right here with you after all. But we need to recognize how much of our lives are lived in our heads as opposed to just really what's going on out there. It's what we think about what happens to us that determines our experience. I'm not sure what Dad thought about his new roommate, but I do know that given the conditions, they became fast friends. They depended on each other in ways that none of us will ever be able to understand. That kind of changed things a little later on, which we'll talk about later, but nevertheless, they formed this kind of connection. I mentioned the Black March a little while ago. In February of 1945, you're going to want to remember these months, these dates. February 1945, they left camp because the Russian army was advancing. Stalag Luft 4 was based in what is now Poland. Nobody wanted to be liberated by the Russian army. So the guards and the prisoners left camp to try to get away from that advancing eastern front. They were told the march would last for 3 days. It wound up lasting for nearly 4 months. And the day they left, it was 15 degrees. There was 14 inches of snow on the ground. You can imagine why it's called the Black March. Survivors lost on average 1/3 of their body weight. Whenever they had food, which wasn't often, it was sometimes things like 3 bushels of potatoes to try to feed 8,000 men. Dad told me about one time when they slept in a barn. He rooted around in the straw trying to find a warm place and found a chicken's nest that had 4 eggs in it. He said, "I ate those eggs raw, and it was the best meal I have ever had." And they marched for 86 days. They battled pneumonia, dysentery, diphtheria, pellagra, typhus, trench foot, tuberculosis. Unimaginable situation. When a prisoner became too weak, he would fall by the side of the road. A guard would drop back, and there would be a shot heard. And the guard rejoined the column alone. This continued through until May, remember that month, May 1945. As they were marching down the road, their guards on either side of them, the guards peeled off to be replaced by a column on each side of British soldiers. It took them a few minutes to realize what had happened because they just kept marching. But they marched to a hospital where they got their first real meal in weeks. Now remember that date, May 1945. In those days, when prisoners were liberated, they took them to the hospital, gave them a few meals, mainly to make sure they didn't overeat. When you've gone through malnutrition, eating too much too fast can just finish killing you. And so they made sure that these prisoners didn't gorge themselves, and then they sent them home. They didn't know post-traumatic stress disorder. They knew shell shock. Counseling was available, but for the most part, it was just turned down because it wasn't manly. And they just went back home. By June 1945, he is back in the little West Tennessee town that he had joined the Army to get away from. His now best friend, Cleo, is there, and Mary, his wife, forever lost to him. They don't know, because he never told anybody how he felt. Cleo knows they used to date, but... So Cleo wants to hang out with Dad, best friend. Dad feels like a fifth wheel. So Mary introduces Dad to one of her friends. They go out. This is, I think, a picture from their first date. With the date of July 15th, if this is not the first date, it's real close to it. July, middle of July. By September 8th, they are married. There are no photos from their wedding. The one photo from that day is where they spent their honeymoon. And if you see up top there, Mayfield, Kentucky, Mayfield is significant because at that time, Kentucky did not have a waiting period. You could get a license and be married 2 minutes later. In other words, they eloped. And that's why there are no pictures of the wedding. In fact, the first pictures that we have of them is dated September 16th, 8 days later. I know it's the first picture because it says so right there. First picture, Mr. and Mrs. King. They don't look happy, do they? Now you've got to understand, before I move on, Mom and Dad loved each other. I have absolutely no doubt about that. But you need to keep that context in mind as I tell you about when Dad told me about the story of them meeting and dating and marrying so fast. The occasion was me sitting with him in a motel room when I have just moved out of the house after the collapse of my second marriage. He's trying to talk me into going back. he tells me this story that I've just told you. And then he says, 10 minutes after I said I do, I realized it was a mistake. And he said, I spent 16 months in a prison camp, but I've spent the rest of my life in a different kind of prison. I think what he meant was this. Though they loved each other, they were not a good match. They each married for their own inappropriate reasons. He was trying to stop the pain. And Mom has her own story. She was trying to get out of the house. A lot of people do that, don't they? But given the time, given the place, given their religious convictions, divorce was out of the question. So they dug in for the long haul. I forgot to advance the slide here. This is the picture of being chained that seems to express the feeling that he gave to me. Were they hypocrites? For the folks back home who might hear this on the internet, they may be shocked by this. I want to re-emphasize, they loved each other. They were just human, with all of the things that come along with being human. You see, I tell my speech students for dealing with communication anxiety, you're always comparing your insides to everyone else's outsides. Everyone else always looks more confident than you feel. It's that way for families too. Dr. Bradshaw talked about that. We know our own families. We only see what other families choose for the outside world to see. So most of us think our families are more screwed up than anybody else's. The fact is, we're just human. And for those who might think that they were hypocrites, I would say that they showed amazing strength and fortitude and commitment. It's not what happens to you, but what you think about what happens to you that determines your experience. Kind of reminds me of a Far Side cartoon. You guys remember the Far Side, Gary Larson? Okay. To respect his copyright, I'm not going to show you the cartoon, but I'll describe it to you. It showed a couple of guys in a fishing boat. They're on a lake. In the background are 3 mushroom clouds. One of them's looking at the clouds. The other guy says, "What does it mean, Norm?" "I'll tell you what it means. It means we can forget about the size restrictions and screw the limits." What does it mean? For him, it means the rules don't apply anymore. So I can't show you the cartoon. I'll just have to show you a coffee mug. What do the rules mean to you? After Dad told me of how they met and the wedding and made the comment about prison camp, he told me about a time when I was about 5 years old. 4 years old. Yeah, that's me. He said, when you were about 4 years old, I had had all I could stand. And I left for 3 days. But he said, I couldn't stay gone. I couldn't leave you alone with your mother. So I came back for you. And so he was trying to get me to go back, you see. For him, the meaning was about commitment. And folks, commitment is a really strong value for me too. But I said to him, "Dad, did you ever think about the possibility that as bad as kids of divorce have it, and the research shows that they do, but it's not a universal. Sometimes the kids are better off if they're not in a household where people are fighting all the time." He looked like he had been shot. The thought had never occurred to him. And he got up and went over to the little desk in the motel room, pulled out his checkbook, and wrote me a check for $500. And never said another word about it. That was the end of the conversation. I'm not telling you that I wish Mom and Dad had split. They needed each other in ways that I don't think either one of them understood. It's just that until it was put in concrete form, he hadn't even thought about that possibility. Alfred Korzybski, the founder of General Semantics, is one among many who has said the way we describe our experience shapes our experience more than the experience itself. Sounds like another way to say it's not what happens to us, but what we think about what happens to us that determines our experience. This is still not the greatest story never told. So it's 1945, they have married. The couples remained friends. He kept all this bottled up inside. Cleo and Mary moved to Texas, later divorced. And they pretty much lost touch with each other, except that over the years he would hear occasionally that she had remarried and then divorced and then remarried and divorced. And sometime in there, Cleo died. And 25 years went by like that. Just kind of normal years. You've already seen me at 4 years old. I found this picture of me. Not quite sure how old I am there, but I put it in there because it looks like a little resemblance to that earlier picture I showed you. I like to think so anyway. I can't tell, by the way, I haven't mentioned, Mom and Dad literally had 40 photo albums. They were addicted to taking pictures. And there are at least 30 pictures like this. Every time I did something in school, they commemorated it by taking a picture of Dad shaking hands with me as I came in the door. You have to take the photo out of the photo album and turn it over to read on the back what it's for. For this one, I had won the spelling bee. So there's all these pictures where Dad is getting older and I'm getting taller, but otherwise they just look alike. Some of my students have heard about the first car. Oh, yeah. There's actually a story with Mom and Dad associated with that. They got me that car, and I was very proud of it. When I went to college, that thing got me all the way through high school and a couple of years of college. They came down to visit and said, let me take the car and get the oil change for you, get service done to it. And as a surprise, they traded it in and got me what was a newer car, a 1971 Chevy Nova. They had no idea what they had done. They were just trying to be kind, you know. So things just kind of normal. They lived in the same house from 1946 until 1997. One of the things I want to try to get across to you is that it wasn't all grim, okay? I mean, Dad loved to laugh. He was quiet, but he had this wonderful laugh. There was a time he had this nervous habit. He couldn't stay still. And he had this nervous habit of tossing things when he was talking. Don't know how this is going to work in this light. Usually it was a coin purse. You remember those old-fashioned kind of coin purses like your grandfather carried? And while he was talking, he would toss that thing. One day, when it was driving me nuts, I waited until it got to the top of the ark and I snatched it out of the air. He looked surprised, and then he laughed. 2 or 3 weeks later, he was doing it again. And just about the time I went to snatch it out of the air, he beat me to it, snatched it out, and he said, ha ha. He set me up. That was that little bit of playfulness coming out. So, same house from 1946 to 1997 until suddenly, one day, literally, they sold the house and moved into a mobile home over here to be close to us. It lasted 3 weeks. Mom was absolutely adamant that they had to get back to West Tennessee. People over here were too weird. She didn't like the food. She didn't like the weather. She didn't like anything about it. Dad took me for a walk, and he said she could worry the tail off a brass monkey. I want to stay here with you guys, but I'll never hear the end of it, so we got to move back. And they sold that mobile home at a $15,000 loss. These folks who for their whole life had agonized over spending an extra 15 cents, the difference between a medium-sized Coke and a large Coke. $15,000 loss so that they could go back to West Tennessee. They moved into a retirement home over there, and over the next 5 years, they moved 13 times. Who had never moved from that house from 46 to 97. It was always Mom, and I don't say that to be critical of her, okay? It's just that Mom always blamed Dad's restlessness. But it was always Mom who was unhappy wherever she was. I think it was really because the house was gone. No place felt like home. But that was the story she was telling herself, you see. Dad's restless, we have to move. Whenever they would land somewhere, he would go to the VA. When he was over here, he'd go to the VA up in Johnson City. When he was in West Tennessee, he'd go to the VA in Memphis. And his story continued to come out. One day, he came up to me and he said, "You used to be a newspaper reporter. Do you think you could use that internet thing to find Mary?" Now, folks, I hesitated over this. I'm convinced his intentions were honorable. And I thought, yeah, this could be good because I'd been learning at this point about Mary. And I thought this could be a way for him to get some closure to something. On the other hand, it could open up a whole can of worms. Because he also kept saying, "Don't tell your mother." I don't think he meant anything, but he said, she would it would just upset her and there wouldn't be any use to it. Do you think you can find her? I even called his psychiatrist and said, "What do you think? What's going to be best for his treatment?" He went to Memphis to the VA, and he was getting impatient with me. So just because he was sitting there in a waiting room with a phone book beside him in Memphis, he picked up the phone book and started calling people who had the same last name as the last time he knew what her last name was. Now think about this situation, folks. Last time he knew anything about where they were in Texas. She was a serial wedding type. So who would think that she had the same last name, and if she did, that she'd be in Memphis? But it was something he could do, something he had some control over. And on the fourth phone call, she answered. What are the odds? So over the next 5 months or so, because he went down to the VA every month, every time he would go down there, he would call her from the doctor's office. Didn't call from home because, long distance, it shows up on the bill, et cetera, okay? But every time he'd go down there, he would make a phone call. On the 5th month, when he called her, they decided that they would get together at a restaurant on his next visit. Again, I don't think there was anything planned there. He was just going to put some closure to it. So he's making these phone calls. Now, I need to tell you that on the 6th phone call, he's down there and they're getting ready to meet at this restaurant. He calls. Mary doesn't answer. Her daughter answers. Her daughter says, "Mama's not here. She's in the hospital. We think she had a stroke." And then Dad says, let me see, how did he put it? She wouldn't tell me which hospital. She didn't know who I was. I think she's Cleo's daughter. We're on the lawn of that retirement home. Remember where we started with that walk? Dad checks the distance again, reaches into his wallet, pulls out a newspaper clipping, says, "This was in the newspaper today," hands it to me. It's Mary's obituary. And then he walks on ahead without saying another word. Leaves the clipping with me. 2 weeks later, he falls and breaks his hip. 4 weeks later, this man who was the epitome of physical prowess and health dies. I think we can probably share in what did that mean? What did he die of? I know what I think about it. Here's the thing. If Dad had managed to meet Mary I think it might have been sort of like my Chihuahua when I was a kid. I had a Chihuahua. And yes, folks, I wore those striped pants to school. This Chihuahua didn't realize he was a Chihuahua. He thought he was a big dog. The squirrels and the rabbits baited him all the time. We had a huge backyard, and they would run across the yard when they could easily go around. They would run across with him chasing them as fast as his little short legs would go. One day when he was chasing a rabbit, the rabbit got stuck in the wire fence and couldn't get through. The dog had finally caught his rabbit. I was watching this out the back door. The dog stood there like, what do I do now? I think if Dad had managed to meet with Mary, that it might have been like that. You know, what do I do now? But I'm pretty sure that he would have been disappointed. I don't mean to be critical of Mary, just that I came across enough evidence to recognize that, like all of us, she was a human being. She was flawed. She was fallible. He had been living with a fantasy all of those years. And fantasies can't compete with flesh and blood. But the thing is, fantasies, and I missed a slide here. Fantasies can't love you back. I'm glad that we had the time with Dad in Jackson, Madison County General Hospital. He didn't know who we were. He thought, I think, that we were workers in the hospital because he would talk to us about his family. Now, I got to tell you, folks, I was a little nervous because he didn't recognize Mom either. And I wasn't sure if he would say anything about Mary or not. But he would talk about me, to me, as if I was not me. See the situation there? There was a day when Janet and Mom were standing over by the window. I was beside his bed. And Dad's talking to Janet. I think he thinks she's a nurse. And he says, I wish you could meet my son, Don. He had problems in his last marriage. They just weren't right for each other. But he's got a good woman now. And they got married. I've screwed up my PowerPoint here, folks. I got to backtrack just a moment. I told you that I don't think Dad ever said anything to Mom about Mary. I got to wonder, because as I was going through looking for photos here, I can remember being a kid and Mom showing me a picture of Mary in a photo album. Remember those 40 photo albums? They were good friends. She had a lot of pictures of Mary. And she showed me one of those pictures and was teasing Dad, that's your dad's old girlfriend. So I went looking for him to be able to show you a picture. And what I found was a lot of pages like this. So I got to wonder, because taking photos out of a photo album, that was like sacrilege to my mom. But in any case, we're back at Jackson Madison General Hospital, and he's talking about me. And he says Janet and him got married last year. A couple of years ago, I guess what it was at that point. And they're doing really well. I feel really good about it. I was really glad that she was there to hear that, to know that Dad thought that about us. Dad gave me a great gift before he died. Told you about John Bradshaw. Bradshaw says that a chain like this can bind a family for generations. Dad's gift was he told me his story. He told me how things looked to him. He helped me to understand certain things in my own life. This is still not the greatest story never told. Go with me back now to 1974. Go ahead and laugh. The situation at this point, I don't know anything about Mary or really about his war years or whatever. I start dating the foreign exchange student. I fall madly in love. At that time, I don't know what it is now, but at that time the rules were when a foreign exchange student came here and stayed for the high school year, they could not come back for 2 years. We planned to wait the 2 years. She was going to come back, and we were going to marry. I'll tell you why that smiley face is there in a second. When she got back home, her father was horrified that she had sullied herself with a mongrel American. And he told her that no one who was worth anything would ever marry her if anybody ever found out. Needless to say, she didn't come back. For 15 or 20 years, I went through inappropriate relationships, including 2 marriages. I didn't know what I was doing. They were perfectly fine women. We just weren't a good match for each other. And after one of those broke up, I wrote to my old girlfriend just to tell her how things were going in my life, see how things were going in hers. And she wrote back a very supportive letter. But she said, I wish that you wouldn't write anymore because I have never told my husband about you and I don't want him to find out. And that's why I haven't used even a fake name, because I'm afraid that I'll let the name slip out. And any of my friends from high school who happen to see this on the internet, please respect that and don't put her name in any of the comments. So it wasn't until Bradshaw and Dad's story that I realized what I had been doing all this time. Logically, she's not coming back. But there was a part of me that was making it so that when she came back, it would be easy to go to her. Isn't that screwed up? But isn't that human? The stories that we tell ourselves, very often, we don't even realize. There's a woman by the name of Byron Katie who has taken Epictetus's insight and built a methodology around this idea that it's not what happens to us, but what we think about what happens to us that determines our experience. When I realized what was going on here, that high school sweetheart, put her behind me. I cherish the memories like I do all of my memories. But not only can fantasy not compete with flesh and blood can't compete with fantasy when you realize that flesh and blood can love you back. I'm very fortunate to have figured this out so that I could quit living with a fantasy and appreciate how truly lucky I am. But this is still not the greatest story never told. Byron Katie has a methodology that in brief leads you to inquire, as she puts it, to inquire into the things that you think. 4 questions and a turnaround. What it boils down to, I think, is that there are no right or wrong answers here. It's the very act of inquiring into our thoughts that can take the power away to cause pain. It's sort of like, have you ever analyzed a joke and realized the joke's not funny anymore? If you question, not in the sense of doubting, just questioning, if you question your thoughts, they also tend to lose their power to hurt. Now, whether you use the technique or not, it's essential that you recognize the stories you tell yourself, the effect that they have. We're always trying to make sense out of the things that happen to us. Do you have stories that you tell yourself about why I can't complete that degree, or why I can't sing, or why I can't cook, or whatever it is? A story that explains it. They don't have to make sense. You see, one of the stories that we tell ourselves, because it's comforting, it happens that our youngest daughter, who a lot of you know is a special needs daughter, was born exactly 9 months after Dad died. And we tell ourselves that he went there and picked her out for us. And I know there's no logic to that, but it helps. It helps to deal with the experience. Almost certainly there are things that you remember that aren't factual because, we put those things together in our heads. I have no way of checking what Dad told me, what Mom told me. I don't even trust my own memory. This is things that are at least 10 years old. I've lost the clipping. I carried it around in my wallet for a long time. I don't know what happened to it. But in terms of the effect, I keep doing that, don't I? I'm sorry. In terms of the effect on our lives, it really doesn't matter. That's why for counselors, they don't concern themselves too much. People who think they've been abducted by aliens, they don't have to find out if it's real or not. They help the people deal with the effects, the trauma, because it's the believing it that causes the trauma. And we're very glad to have Hannah. Some people look at our situation and say, how do you deal with that? I tell them that no parent knows what's going to happen with their kids. We just happen to not have the illusion of certainty. It's a story that is helpful. Now, here's how I would sum this up. When I was in college, I knew of twin boys. I know these aren't boys, okay? It's just illustrating the idea of twins. I knew about twin boys, identical twins. One of them was an alcoholic because Dad was an alcoholic. Went through several marriages, got arrested for beating his wife. That was the way Dad was, all that kind of thing. His brother wouldn't touch alcohol because Dad was an alcoholic. Was in the same marriage for 25 years at that point, model husband, dependable worker, because he didn't want to be like Dad. He didn't want the reputation. Both of them even using the word because, as in caused by. It's not really about a caused by. It's about a choice. It's about a decision. It's about the stories that we tell ourselves. What are the stories you tell yourself? I told you Mom has her own story, and there's definitely not time for us to go into that. But the stories that she told about her upbringing in life had to do with things like a father who locked her in the closet in the dark for punishment for hours at a time, who was apparently an alcoholic. A doctor who told her she was too sensitive to be able to go to college, and so she never went. And maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I don't know. I know that she believed it. And my mom, with her story, up until her death, or really up until she quit talking, she had Alzheimer's there towards the end. She said, I can't help it. I can't help being the way that I am. My daddy made me this way. She died a little over a year ago, never having a sense of her own power. And I'm not criticizing her. I'm not saying she was wrong. But I can see for both of them the strength of the stories that we tell ourselves. It's not what happens to you. It's what you think about what happens to you that determines your experience. When someone asks Byron Katie, are you enlightened? She says, honey, I don't know anything about that. I just know the difference between what hurts and what doesn't. And the stories that we tell ourselves can be the source of that pain. So here's my challenge to you. Recognize the stories that you tell. Recognize how they affect your life. Recognize the choices that you make in telling those stories. Because Daddy was that way? Maybe so, but what choice are you making as a result of it? I'm one of those people that when I watch a movie, sometimes I want it to turn out a different way. You know what I'm talking about? And when I watch it a second time, I know it's not going to be any different, but there's a part of me. There's a part of me that's rooting for it to be different. I'm still mad about the way that Serenity movie turned out. And I see that there's not a whole lot of Firefly fans out there. Okay. We can take the movie thing and make use of it. I'm told that Stephen King when he writes a book, he puts characters into a difficult situation and then follows them around to see what they do. And it turns out some great books, doesn't it? But the problem can be, King says he's got several manuscripts in his desk where he got them into some situation and he couldn't figure out how to get them out. So the book's not finished. J.K. Rowling, I'm told, before she ever wrote the first Harry Potter book, not only knew how that book would turn out, but knew how the last book would turn out. She decided ahead of time how the story was going to turn out. The greatest story never told, of course, is your story. You are the author of it. You are the writer. You're the director. It's still in process. It hasn't been told because you're still in that process. It would be the greatest tribute to my mom and dad if you would be conscious in that process. What are you going to tell? That's the greatest story never told. I appreciate the time that you decided to spend with me today. Thank you. I should have had a "that's all, folks" to close it out. I'm sorry.
Really, Mark.
Thanks, John. Well done. I was going to say good job, and it came out John instead of John.
I appreciate it. I can't tell you how many times I had to rehearse it. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. That was had to be painfully intimate.
It was. I debated about whether Mom and Dad would even want